Yeah, it is recording. Fantastic. So today we're delighted to welcome Claire Lowrie as the first speaker in our Semester 1 Environmental Exchange Seminar Series, which is on climate histories. The series is the Centre for Environmental History's opportunity to showcase and discuss innovative new research that engages with key themes in environmental history, whether or not our speakers actually think of themselves as environmental historians. And I imagine Claire is one such speaker. Claire is an associate professor in history and history discipline leader at the University of Wollongong. Her research focuses on the history of colonialism and labour in tropical Northern Australia and Southeast Asia, which we will hear about today. She is Chief Investigator on 2 current ARC discovery projects that explore these themes. And she is the author of Masters and Servants, Cultures of Empire in the Tropics, which was published with Manchester University Press, and a co-author of Colonialism and Male Domestic Service Across the Asia Pacific from Bloomsbury in 2019. And as well as publishing her work through scholarly avenues, Claire is enthusiastic about creating histories that engage audiences beyond the academy. Today, she will demonstrate some of the environmental aspects of her broader research in her paper entitled Hill Station for Whom? Chinese Elites, Hill Stations and Contested Racial Discrimination in Interwar Colonial Malaya and the Philippines. Thank you, Claire.
Great. Okay, thank you, Jess. And I would also like to acknowledge that I'm giving this paper on Ngunnawal Ngambri land and to extend my respect to Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal peoples that might be in the room or on Zoom. So, and I also want to thank Jess and Ruth for inviting me to present. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in person and to be back in Canberra. So I wanted to begin just by giving you a bit of context about where my work fits and sits or doesn't really sit at all in terms of environmental history. So I'm a historian of colonialism and labour in the tropics, especially in Northern Australia and Southeast Asia. And I've worked largely on histories of domestic service, but also histories of indenture, focusing on Chinese workers in particular. But one theme that kind of permeates the story of colonialism in the tropics is that of climate and heat and humidity and how to manage heat and humidity. And there's an extensive literature that you're probably all aware of on theories of environmental determinism and how the idea of the tropics as a place of degeneration was debated, how officials and scholars and doctors and scientists kind of came to terms with it and how it shaped the colonial encounter. So there's that broad literature. I guess my work has been more focused on everyday ways of dealing with heat and social and cultural kind of responses to heat, including things like employing servants in colonial households.
It might just...
Let's try, yep, success. As a strategy to cope with the heat, but also as a means of demonstrating power and dominance in colonial society. And in this image, you can see a very distinct nod to the climate. It's a postcard, and if you look towards the top of the frame, you'll see the punkah, the manually operated fan, manually operated fan in the frame. At this point, it's stationary, so you don't see the Malay or Indian domestic worker that were employed in households to operate those fans. So the ability to avoid hard physical labour, the opportunity to have a worker cool your sweaty body, this was a response to the climate, but it was one contingent on class privilege, the ability to be able to afford to employ domestic servants. And it wasn't just white colonists who used that strategy. In places like Singapore, Chinese elites and other elites also employed numerous domestic workers in the home. And here we see a Straits Chinese or Peranakan family with a young male servant, probably Malay. And I think that's an issue, or this highlights an issue that hasn't been unpacked in the existing literature on colonialism in the tropics, how non-white people struggled with and adapted to living in a tropical climate. So that's how I came to this paper that looks at the experiences of Chinese elites who sought access to the hill stations of colonial Malaya and the Philippines on the basis of their class privilege. and the systems of racial discrimination that operated and limited their access to these places of respite. And by hill stations, I mean mountain retreats built at high elevation, established by colonial powers as a means to provide periods of respite from lowland tropical heat, especially urban heat. So the British in India and the Dutch in Indonesia were the first imperial powers to build these kinds of hill stations, and similar from about the 18th century, and similar in British India is perhaps the most famous one of those hill stations. In this paper, I'm focused on Baguio in the Philippines, and I also look at Penang Hill, Fraser's Hill, and the Cameron Highlands in British Malaya. So the study of hill stations is by no means a new field of inquiry. From about the 1970s, geographers, especially Robert R. Reed, published widely on the origins and kind of urban planning that underpinned this form of settlement in a variety of colonial contexts. In the 1990s, the focus of kind of scholarly attention shifted, with historians and geographers more interested in how hill stations related to scientific and cultural conceptions of race, racial hierarchy, and climate. So historians of India, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean from the 1990s up until today have analysed the shared vision of the colonial hill station as crucial to the health of white colonisers and necessary for the demonstration of colonial power. They also argued, oh, yep, go for it.
Just
see, I didn't have frame
That's
peace
all
of mind, but anyway, just is totally onto it, so I can relax. So yeah, they've also argued that while these places were envisioned as kind of bastions for white colonial rulers, hill stations were actually very much multi-ethnic places. They were contact zones that brought together European colonists, Indigenous people of the highlands, local lowland people, and Asian migrants who are engaged as workers, as labourers or service providers. So the multi-ethnic conception or composition of hill stations has been acknowledged. But what there's been an absence of is analysis or even acknowledgement of the presence of Asian migrants, elite migrants, as tourists, as people who went to these hill stations to rest, Asian migrants who came to rest, as opposed to Asian migrant workers who came to work. So by focusing on local diasporic Chinese elites and visiting Chinese tourists who sought out healthful holidays at the hill stations of the Philippines and Malaya, my paper takes a new approach to the history of the hill stations. And in doing that, it brings together accounts of well-to-do Chinese people contained in official correspondence, in memoirs, in photographs, and in newspaper articles as well. And what these sources really indicate very clearly is that Chinese elites actively sought out the supposed therapeutic and also the political benefits of a stay on a hill station. So it contributes to the literature on hill stations, and also that broader literature on climate and colonialism. But I'm also aiming in this paper to build our historical understandings of the diverse nature of Chinese experiences in colonial societies. Historians of Chinese diaspora have long sought to challenge the stereotypical view of Chinese migrants as inherently unfree coolies. Most recently, May Nai's 2001 book, The Chinese Question. And this paper seeks to build on or contribute to that work. It develops a more nuanced understanding by highlighting how particular groups of wealthy Chinese accessed or attempted to access a space that marked them as colonial elites. This paper, and my work in general, I guess, uses a comparative and transcolonial methodology to highlight colonial connections and commonalities, but also differences and distances between these upland geographies. So in designing Baguio, the Americans drew inspiration from Simla in British India, as well as from plans for the site developed by the Spanish predecessors. The committees responsible for developing Fraser's Hill and the Cameron Highlands were also influenced by British India, but the hill station that they wanted to emulate was the garden city of Baguio. So the design of hill stations in the Philippines and Malaya was underpinned by a common imperial logic and indicates the sharing of ideas across colonies and across empires. But the ways in which these spaces were used differed markedly. In the case of Baguio, class status was the most important factor in determining access and social inclusion under the American administration. And this focus on class ensured that China's elites could easily visit Baguio for rest and recreation. On the Malayan hill stations, conceptions of race were much more important, and the focus of the British administration on ideas of race and racial hierarchy ensured that Chinese elites had only limited access to these sites. So in terms of understanding what I mean when I talk about British Malaya, this is a loose term, British Malaya, and it encapsulates a kind of a range of colonies. So it consisted of distinct administrative entities that spanned the island of Singapore and the Malay Peninsula. The hill stations that I'm talking about today were confined to the Straits Settlements, which was administered from Singapore and established in 1826, and also the Federated Malay States, governed from Kuala Lumpur from 1895. The oldest hill station was Penang Hill, located on Penang Island in the Straits Settlements. And the hill stations of the Federated Malay States included the small settlement of Maxwell's Hill above Taiping in Perak, and the much larger and more developed sites of Fraser's Hill, which opened in 1922, and the Cameron Highlands in 1930, both in the state of Pahang. And I should note that the map you're looking at here is from 1949, so it's a period when these colonial territories had actually become the Federation of Malaya, with Singapore as a separate colony. But I really like it because it shows really clearly where the hill stations were located and also gives you a sense of access to those sites. In terms of the Philippines, Luzon, here's a map of Luzon. The US colonialism in the Philippines was forged through war, with the defeat of Spain in 1898, and then of the Filipino nationalist forces in 1902, the American military administration became a civilian one. And like the Spanish before them, the Americans based their administration in Manila on Luzon Island. It was also on Luzon, atop the Central Cordillera Mountains, that Baguio was established, with the road opening up in 1905. And by the 1930s, it was very easily reached from Manila with road and rail links that you can see very clearly here. So I'm interested in the Chinese elites that chose or sought to use these spaces in the interwar period. But what do I actually mean when I talk about Chinese elites? So as scholars of Chinese migration and diaspora have pointed out, Chineseness is not a fixed or homogeneous ethnic identity, but is culturally and historically contingent. My focus is on people who identified as Chinese, self-identified as Chinese, or were identified by the colonial state as Chinese based on their birthplace, ethnicity, citizenship, and legal name. So in terms of Malaya, I focus on the Chinese migrant community that retained Chinese citizenship and fit loosely into the category of overseas Chinese, or Huachao. So the Chinese majority comprised of a majority population in the Straits Settlement and a very significant minority in the Federated Malay States. By 1910, they were on par with the Malay population. As well as being a really large community, this was also a very culturally diverse community. So the major dialect groups included Hokkiens, Teochew, Cantonese, Hakka, and Hainanese. And so I'm interested in the overseas Chinese community. I'm also interested in the Creolized Peranakan or Straits Chinese communities of Malaya. So this was a local born community. They were the descendants of very early marriages between Chinese settlers and Malay women. Under the British administration, they were British subjects, but they retained a distinct Chinese identity. They were identified by Chinese and as Chinese by the state, and they saw themselves as Chinese, albeit a distinct group as well. What I don't focus on here are the Creolized Chinese community of the Philippines, so the Chinese mestizo. They're not my focus. This group were the descendants of Chinese men and local women that married during the Spanish era. They embraced Catholicism and Hispanic cultural traditions. And under the American administration, they became Filipino citizens. And that was because the Americans divided the population into Filipino or non-Filipino alien. And the Chinese mestizo community saw the benefit of being Filipino. There were very significant legal benefits to being identified as such. So my focus instead is the Chinese residents of the Philippines that had migrated more recently and retained Chinese cultural traditions or Chinese citizenship and were identified by the Americans as a distinct cultural group, literally called Chinese aliens. So my focus is on Chinese aliens or overseas Chinese, and they're a very small minority, but economically very significant in the Philippines. Most were based in Manila. Most were of Hokkien descent. This was very much a well-to-do community, largely because of the Chinese Exclusion Act being extended to the Philippines in 1903. Which was supposed to prevent Chinese labourers from coming into the colony, but from which Chinese merchants and their families were exempted, so they were able to still come over. So the overrepresentation of wealthy Chinese in the Philippines was in stark contrast to British Malaya, where they were largely of labouring class origin. So quite kind of different Chinese communities that we're dealing with here. In the next part of the paper, I analyse how American colonial administrators in the Philippines and British officials in Malaya responded to the desire of Chinese diasporic communities to make use of the hill stations. The attitudes of the British and the Americans towards wealthy Chinese visitors to their hill stations exposes the contrasting ways in which they understood and justified their colonial objectives. It also reveals how social privilege and discrimination shaped who could gain access to respite from the so-called enervating climate of the plains. So first to Baguio. The opening up of the road up the Cordillera Mountains in 1905 allowed for really rapid development of Baguio. Like the hill stations of British India, it was designed to serve as a summer capital to which administrators and their entourages could relocate in the hottest months of the year. And by the 1910s, American officials and hundreds of American and Filipino government employees were travelling to Baguio in the summer months to conduct the affairs of state. The famous American architect, Daniel Burnham, famous, for example, for Chicago, was recruited to design the city. And while his plans for Baguio were never fully realised, his influence can be seen in the expansive gardens and very organised town centre that you get a bit of a sense of in this 1920 map. Baguio was also praised for its modern facilities. It possessed electric lighting and power, a steam laundry, wood hotels, water and sewer systems, telephones, a taxi service, and various sporting facilities. And again, you get a sense of that modernity. It doesn't even look like you're in Southeast Asia. When you look at this image from 1929, it could be an American city. The building of Baguio was expensive, incredibly expensive, especially the road, and required feats of engineering mastery. And as a result, it was heavily criticised in the Filipino nationalist press. And the Americans responded to that criticism by emphasizing the benefits of Baguio, not just for the Americans, but for the Filipino people too. As Governor General Forbes put it in his official correspondence in 1909, the development of Baguio would, quote, take the terrors of the Manila heat away for the Americans and would be equally beneficial for the Filipinos themselves. And these claims of the Americans were consistent with a civilizing mission built on notions of benevolent assimilation and tutelage. Baguio was promoted as a place where a supposedly, and I'm quoting here, weak and feeble race could be transformed into a strong, healthy, and enduring people capable of self-government. So, and again, more examples, this one from just a guidebook from 1912. So as the guidebook put it, the opportunity to spend considerable time at altitude would in due course result in a profound alteration in the general physique and temperament of the Filipino people. The Americans also saw Baguio as a place where they could build a class of political collaborators from amongst the wealthy Filipino and mestizo people as well. By the mid-1920s, the hill station was famed as the best in Southeast Asia, a wonder city of the Orient, as claimed in this full-page advertisement from the Manila Times from 1928. And it's also interesting, I think, this advertisement, because it gives you a sense of the range of businesses, give you a sense of how people were getting to Baguio, and that these are people with money. So there's advertisements for car hire, including a chauffeur, or for those who had their private vehicles, there are advertisements for tyres and for gasoline as well, petrol. So by the 1930s, Baguio is attracting about or more than 60,000 visitors annually from around the region. By the 1940s, it's 100,000 visitors each year. In a context in which a hill station holiday was viewed as an antidote to oppressive heat, as well as a means of demonstrating social and political prestige, it's perhaps no surprise that visitors to Baguio included Chinese elites from Manila, as well as Chinese visitors from abroad. And the desire of Chinese people to head for the hills was probably also influenced by the development of Kuling, now Guling, located atop Mount Lu in Jiangxi province, a hill station that was established by British and American missionaries in the late 19th century, but by the 1930s was very definitely an enclave for Chinese political elites who went there for recreation and power brokering as well. So under Chiang Kai-shek's Republican government, Kuling became the summer capital, where the top officials of the nationalist government were relocated from Nanjing from June to August each year. The wealthy residents of Manila perhaps had Kuling in mind when they travelled to Baguio by train in the comfort of first-class air-conditioned cabins before travelling by car, before transferring by car for the last part of the winding journey up the mountains. And it was really windy. And again, you see that in these images. By the 1930s, they also travelled via passenger planes of the Philippines Aerial Taxi and Navigation Company, or PATCO. So very much moneyed kind of individuals. Some opted to stay at the exclusive Pines Hotel, while others preferred the Washington Hotel, managed from 1927 by well-known Chinese community leader and hotelier K.S. England. One such visitor was the very prominent D.C. Chuan, who was a businessman and a philanthropist and had built his fortune in the timber industry. He was also very prominent in the banking sector. His reason for visiting Baguio was perhaps partly to be seen, but it was also likely health-related. So he came in Easter 1929 and he was suffering from tuberculosis, a condition said to benefit by a temperate climate. Chinese economic elites like Di rubbed shoulders with Chinese political and community leaders, such as Chinese consul Kwan-Sung Yang, who regularly visited Baguio from his base in Manila. And as well as residents from Manila, Chinese tourists also came to Baguio from overseas. So very prominent doctors, professors, military generals, elite sports people, all came from places like Hong Kong and Shanghai to visit Baguio. So this was a hill station that was promoted as, quote, the meeting place for men and women of all nationalities, occupations, and classes. However, it remained a destination for the rich and was well out of reach for ordinary Filipinos. And that was another point that the Filipino nationalist press returned to again and again. So this was an elite multi-ethnic enclave established by colonial administration that claimed to be more democratic and inclusive than the old world colonizers. But such rhetoric did little to obscure the fact that inclusion was entirely dependent on class privilege. While their presence in Baguio was accepted on the basis of their economic status, the broader context of anti-Chinese rhetoric and legislation probably shaped the experiences of Chinese people who came to the hill station. And you can see the influence of anti-Chinese settlement just by glancing through the Manila Times, where you see dozens of negative editorials and reports about the Chinese community, literally published alongside accounts of Chinese elites traveling to Baguio. So things like calls for Chinese residents of the Philippines to be registered, tougher measures to prevent immigration, accounts of violence within the community as well. In 1935, the political status of the Philippines changed when it was granted partial self-government by the Americans, but still very much under American control in a lot of ways. Manuel Quezon was the elected president, and his nationalistic government became responsible for most domestic matters, including administering Baguio. And it was during this Filipino Commonwealth era that overt examples of racial exclusion on Baguio emerged. So Filipino government representatives sought to limit the economic activities of the Chinese community in Baguio and their ability, if not to visit, definitely to settle. Chinese residents were also subject to really intense policing by immigration officials who started coming to all the shops and checking the status of the Chinese in Baguio. Were they allowed to be there, or had they contravened the terms of the Chinese Exclusion Act? So it was Filipino government representatives rather than the Americans that directed repressive measures against the Chinese community of Baguio. And they did so in the context of heightened Filipino nationalism and a sense of economic insecurity fostered by the Great Depression. However, the rationale underpinning this intense policing of the Chinese community really stemmed from the racist ideologies established first by the Americans. As Richard T. Chu has argued, the creation of racial and legal distinctions between Filipino citizens and Chinese aliens by the American regime made the Chinese community really easy targets for economic scapegoating by Filipino nationalists. While in Baguio, racial discrimination was hardening in the 1930s, established systems of racial exclusion were being challenged on the Malayan hill stations. And I'll turn to Malaya now. So Fraser's Hill, now known as Bukit Fraser, opened in 1922. And in contrast to the kind of bustling summer capital of Baguio, it was a sleepy retreat that serviced small numbers of British officials and their families. Visitors made the short trip from Kuala Lumpur by car, as you can see in this image, arriving to a small town centre surrounded by dense forests and distant mountain peaks. 9 government bungalows were established on the site by 1926, and priority access to those bungalows was given to high-ranking civil servants who from 1935 were granted permission to conduct official business from Fraser's Hill for 3 weeks per year. Bungalows were also established to accommodate British veterans of the First World War and their families. The regulations governing access to those bungalows were modelled on those developed for Penang Hill 30 years earlier. and they were vague in how they operated in terms of who could get access to these sites. They indicated that bungalows were, quote, intended for the use of person whose own residences are equal to them in all substantial particulars. And they also gave the on-site superintendent or lady superintendent the prerogative to, quote, refuse an application without assigning any clause. And it was that clause that was used to prevent Malayan Chinese from accessing the government bungalows. And we can see that play out in the archival record. So in April 1925, Yap Tai Chi, a prominent Chinese entrepreneur and philanthropist, wrote to the superintendent responsible for Fraser's Hill, requesting permission to stay at one of the bungalows. The superintendent responded quickly and informed him that no accommodation was currently available. Yap wrote again, suggesting alternative dates, to which he received the same response. And it was only following a third attempt that the superintendent finally informed Yap that the bungalows at Fraser's Hill are mainly for government officials and Europeans. Yap, who made his fortune in rubber and tin, was at the absolute peak of colonial society in Malaya. Like other Chinese men of his status, he cultivated close relationships with British government officials and Malay rulers, and he regularly socialised with members of those groups. He also served on various government boards and was a leader within the Chinese community as well. So his willingness to assert his right to respite on Fraser's Hill reflects that prominence and also the impatience with colonial inequalities, that impatience that was fostered, especially following the emergence of kind of Chinese nationalism. So following his rejection by the superintendent, an incensed Yap then wrote to the British resident of Selangor asking for clarification on whether any respectable Asiatic could be given permission to enjoy the privilege in occupying the bungalows at Fraser's Hill. And in a terse response, the secretary for the resident just kind of fobbed him off and informed him that it was a federal government issue, that it was not the decision of the residents at all, and correspondence should be directed there. The principles of racial segregation that underpinned the use of government bungalows on Fraser's Hill reflected the broader approach of the British to colonial governance. The colonial regime in Malaya was sustained through the assertion of white superiority and the principles of divide and rule that were mapped onto the landscape. So Malaya's hill stations, like the urban centres of Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, reflected a desire of colonial officials to divide the population along lines of class and ethnicity. As Amrita Mali has argued, by seeking to confine particular communities to particular spaces, the British sought to define the identities of their subjects and the role they played in colonial society. What Karl Hacker's termed geodemographic control remained a central tactic of British rule up until the era of independence. It was, however, a tactic that was constantly challenged by Chinese elites in the interwar era, including through the vernacular press and especially in regards to the use of hill stations. So from the 1920s, the question of Asian elites' access to hill stations became a topic of sustained discussion in the press. The Malaya Tribune and its weekly offering, the Malayan Saturday Post, were vocal in their criticism of the racial exclusion that operated on hill stations. This is an English language press, but it's one financed by wealthy Straits Chinese and Eurasians, and it was read by educated Asians across Malaya. It was also read by the British as well. Editorials asserted that Fraser's Hill and the newly developed Cameron Highlands should be open to the various communities in Malaya, including Asiatics of a suitable qualification. As an editorial from 1930 put it, non-Europeans provide the bulk of public revenue in Malaya, and many may not unreasonably protest against large slices of those revenues being spent on the indulgence of a small minority of the community. The Chinese language newspapers, financed by leading Chinese merchants based in Singapore and read by the literate Chinese community across Malaya, also reflected on the growing frustration of wealthy Chinese people about their exclusion from hill stations. And they talked about cooling as well, but they reflected on Malaya, noting that, you know, they're open to British officials, but not us ordinary Chinese people. By 1932, even the conservative Straits Times, at that point catering mainly to a British readership, concluded that Asiatic taxpayers rightly begrudged the amount of public money spent on Fraser's Hill, as they derive literally no benefit from it. The issue came to a head when the Straits Settlements government put forward a proposal to improve the road up to Penang Hill in 1933. And this was a scheme that received widespread condemnation in the press, including this particularly scathing editorial, which I love, from the Malayan Saturday Post titled "Hill Station for Whom?" The editorial featured a cartoon drawn by well-known Malacca-based cartoonist Yan Ki Leong. And Yan drew the public as a Chinese rickshaw puller struggling to transport the official council to white men in solar topis up to the golf links of Penang Hill. And you can really see that sense of being exploited in terms of Chinese labour, but also Chinese capital in the caption as well, public money on developing a hill station at Penang. Would this expenditure be mainly for the benefit of government officials? So the Penang Hill road proposal failed, and it failed to pass the Legislative Council in large part due to the opposition of Straits Chinese councillor Lim Ching Yan. Lim was a prominent lawyer who'd been educated at Cambridge and was serving his second term of appointment on the Legislative Council. And underpinning his critique of developing the road was a sense of racial injustice and the need and the way that it shaped public and private life in Malaya. So Lim rejected the proposal on the basis of what he termed, in his words in the press, the colour question. He recalled that when Penang Hill was established, the Chinese were not allowed up the hill. The top was reserved for Europeans. And the reason British officials provided, according to Lim, was that coming from a warmer climate, they would not want to go to the top. So these are quotes from him, and he's saying this to British officials in the Legislative Council. And that kind of claim was, in Lim's word, entirely wrong. Yet bureaucratic red tape, complex rules, and discriminatory policies continued to prevent Chinese residents of Penang and Singapore from full use of the site. Lim himself was only able to build halfway up the hill. The public debates over racial exclusions on Fraser's Hill and Penang Hill took place at a time when the Cameron Highlands was starting to be developed. So the hill station officially opened in 1930, and it was celebrated as a healthy hill station for the residents of Europeans. Such conceptions were reflected in the establishment of 2 schools for the education of white children only. And accommodation in the Highlands also favoured British visitors, with Cameron Highlands Hotel given full government support and backing, and that was a hotel that only British people or Europeans were allowed to stay in. Even so, there's evidence that by this time, the vision of a racially exclusive hill station wasn't a priority of the government anymore, and things had kind of moved on. So to give you one example, the Eastern Hotel was established in 1939 and was given support by the government to be established. So that was opened at Tanah Rata. And it was a hotel that was developed through Chinese capital and with the explicit goal of offering accommodation to Asian visitors. So by the 1930s, significant numbers of wealthy Chinese were driving to the Cameron Highlands. Others came as far as they could by rail before transferring to car for the final leg of the journey. And they'd also purchased private bungalows too. A changing vision for the colonial hill station can also be seen in the 1939 tourism campaign that sought to attract a wider class of visitors to the Cameron Highlands. So a campaign funded by the government. So the accompanying poster featured a young woman of Asian appearance holidaying with a white man. And this suggests a willingness on the part of public officials to foster a more racially inclusive hill station, if only in the pursuit of profit. So, to bring this to a conclusion, this paper has sought to develop new insights into the history of the hill station by analysing how they were perceived of and used by Chinese elites, wealthy Chinese residents of Malaya and the Philippines in particular. In doing so, the paper has contributed, hopefully, to the history of the Chinese diaspora by highlighting the diversity of Chinese experiences in different colonies. In both the Philippines and Malaya, Chinese elites navigated social divisions based on class and race in order to access hill stations for respite and to demonstrate their social status. However, their level of access differed markedly due to the distinct visions for hill stations formulated by the Americans as opposed to the British. Baguio was envisioned as a space of assimilation where Filipinos could be prepared for self-government. By building a modern American city in tropical Southeast Asia and by making it accessible to all who had the means to make the trip, Americans sought to portray themselves as more egalitarian and democratic colonizers. While their economic power ensured Chinese residents and tourists could access Baguio, it's likely that anti-Chinese ideologies shaped their experiences on the hill station. During the Commonwealth period, discrimination was overt, with the introduction of policies designed to limit the economic activities and settlement of Chinese aliens in Baguio taking place in the context of heightened Filipino nationalism. The hill stations of Malaya were created as spaces of exclusion from which the health and prestige of British colonists could be nurtured through segregation from their subject populations. Chinese merchants encountered insurmountable barriers when they attempted to access the government bungalows on Fraser's Hill. By the 1930s, Chinese leaders were vocal in their criticisms of the principles and practices of racial discrimination that operated on Malayan hill stations and in society broadly. And such criticisms helped ensure that the Cameron Highlands was established as a more inclusive space. The process of comparing hill stations in the American Philippines and British Malaya shows how common conceptions of race and class influence the organisation of space in particular ways. And it also shows how geographies of colonial occupation changed over time and in sometimes contrasting ways. Just as principles of racial exclusion were beginning to be contested on the Malayan hill stations, Chinese residents in the Philippines were facing heightened racial discrimination in Baguio. Overall, the study of Baguio and the Malayan hill stations provides a deeper understanding of how colonial racism shaped the everyday lives of Chinese elites, including their ability to gain respite from tropical heat. It also shows the methods they used to challenge such discrimination. So that's it. If you're interested, this comes from an article that's just been published and is open access. So if you haven't heard of it,